Hello, everyone. I have some announcements to make. So this week is Public Libraries Week. We have a few events happening all throughout the library. As you might have seen, there's like a desk at the front as you enter into the atrium. They'll be talking about different technological things. So you guys could, there will be coffee and some other things because they're going to be talking about like different technological things. Then on the weekend, we have the used book sale. So it's from 11 to 5 on Saturday and on Sunday. It'll be in here. Also on Sunday, we'll have the bonsai exhibit, which will be in the main art gallery, which is right next to the desk upstairs at the library. Next Monday, we will have Kathy Diamond upstairs in the multipurpose room. And on the 1st of November, we will have Friday afternoon at the movies, and the movie is called Marry Me. Thank you. Mr. Dwoskin, it's Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay, oh yeah, wow, this is so loud. So hi everybody, this is our last class, right, for the...
No, there's next, oh. So next week, I forgot to mention.
Yeah, next week is on Zoom.
Online, yeah.
Yeah, next week is on Zoom, because I'm going, you know, those of you who know me for many years know I love traveling, and not next week, but the week after that, we're going to do about a 6-week trip in Egypt, Sri Lanka, and India. So we'll take a look at I've been to India twice already, and I've never been to Sri Lanka or Egypt. I was actually in Egypt when Israel was in control of the Sinai, so we did a hike there up Mount Sinai, but that was in different times. You know, there's just so many number of different things I wanted to speak about today, but we'll talk about we'll start off by speaking on the theme of elections. And because there was an election, there were 2 elections this week in Canada. There was probably, I don't know if any of you know this, but there actually were one in British Columbia and one in New Brunswick. The one in British Columbia, the results are not known, and they won't be known maybe for a week at least. I would say at least a week. And to contrast that with the American elections, where the elections are bound to be close, and there was one election in the United States where the results were not known on the night of the election. That was the close one between Al Gore and Bush. And, you know, for something that is so important, not to know the results of an election, in the United States, it seems to matter a lot. In British Columbia, everybody's taking a breath and say, okay, fine. You know, we have to, the reason the elections are not known is because it ended up 46 to 45 seats, with recounts in several of them, and where mail-in ballots have not been counted. So, I mean, the results could really go either way when the difference is so close. There are a couple of seats where there were under 200 voters, you know, in a 40,000 voter riding, and you know it's under 200 votes, so they have to do a recount, and you know all this takes time. Nobody's panicking. Nobody's putting out all kinds of ads on television. Nobody's calling it fake, manipulated, rigged. Nothing like that. People are just, you know, say, okay, let the process happen, and then whoever wins, wins, and that's the way it's going to be. In New Brunswick, there was a huge upset. We'll call it a huge upset, but the Liberals defeated the Conservatives by a huge margin in our neighboring province. So, you know, it also shows, and in the British Columbia election, the NDP came out ahead for now. And it's pretty well the same results as happened last time, only the opposition party changed its name. But British Columbia is our most, we'll call it left-wing province. It has elected NDP premiers going back for a long time. And, that record continues up until now. There was another very important election this week, and that took place in Europe's poorest country, Moldova. And Moldova is a former Soviet republic which became independent when the Soviet Union collapsed. If you asked me, the country called Moldova has no business being a country, because it is a small, very poor country located right alongside of Romania. And the people in Moldova, by and large, speak Romanian. And they used to belong to Romania at one time. Of course, at other times they belonged to the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Empire. But they just had an election. They had two elections. They had one election for the leader of the country, and then they had another one, a referendum on should Moldova join the European Union. And that election was extremely hard fought because, as we will talk about, the Russians were spending millions and millions of dollars to try to influence the vote, to try to get the people to vote against joining the European Union, because Russia wants to keep a kind of an alliance of all its former republics. And one of the reasons that Russia invaded the Ukraine was because it felt that the Ukraine should really belong to Russia in one way or another. And so long as there are local strongmen, local dictators who are running the different former Soviet republics, Russia doesn't mind, because it says all these former dictators can work with us. But the moment that the Ukraine elects a democratic and has a fair democratic election, without any civil hostilities, then it's an example to Russia itself. And the Russian people could say, look, if they could do it in the Ukraine, why can't we have free and fair elections in Russia? So that's what Russia doesn't want. And in Moldova, there was a free and fair election. Well, we'll call it partly fair, because Russia was spending so much money to bribe voters to vote for their own candidate and to vote against the European Union, that there was this man who promised every voter $28 if they voted against the European Union proposal. And this man's name, believe it or not, is Ilan Shor. And Ilan is also an Israeli citizen, so he's a Jewish Moldovan, multimillionaire, with very close ties to Russia. And he was forking out money to get people to vote against the referendum, which only passed in true Quebec style, 50.4 to 49.6. It reminds you of something, you remember Jacques Parizeau's referendum, 50.2 to 49.8. So it was really a close result, much closer than most people predicted. But what it does do is it puts Moldova on a path to joining the European Union one day. You have to apply, you have to pass all your exams. They give you a checkup, a financial checkup. They give you a political checkup. They give you a civil rights checkup. And if you pass all the checkups, then you can be a candidate. And once you're a candidate, if you get voted in, you can get admitted. But being admitted to the European Union is huge. It's an enormous benefit because the European Union helps out all its poor members. And Moldova would rank as the poorest of the poor. Even behind Albania, which used to be the poorest of the poor. Now Moldova is the poorest of the poor. But Moldova has another problem. And we'll get on to something else, but it just hit me, so this is a good entree into elections. That there are, um, well, let's just say that, let's just say this is Moldova over here. The Black Sea, the Black Sea is over here like this, Black Sea. Moldova is a little piece like this. Romania is all of this over here. The Ukraine is all of this over here. And Odessa is the closest big city, you know, Odessa in the Ukraine. But then there's a little strip of land going like this. This is a river. The river goes all the way down to the Black Sea. And this little strip of land here was part of Moldova technically, but when Moldova separated from the Soviet Union, the Russians kept this little strip of land over here, and it's called Transnistria. And if any of you remember the history of the Second World War, the Jews from Romania were sent here to die in labor camps, because this is the Dniester River over here, so it's Transnistria, it's over there, and the Tiraspol is the so-called capital. And if you go to Tiraspol, the capital, you'll see statues of Lenin, statues of Stalin, pictures of Marx, Karl Marx, that is. It's like you're living back in the olden days in the Soviet Union. And the Russian, it's Russian speaking, so this section is Russian speaking, so it's not even Ukrainian speaking. Remember, Russia is far away from here, because you have the Ukraine over here, and Russia's all the way down on that side over there, so it's really far separated from Russia. But they kind of took over this little piece of territory, and that's an extra complication, because it technically belongs to Moldova, and if Moldova would join the European Union, then, well, what would happen to this? And it's not like these people who are living here, they don't want to become Ukrainians. They actually want to be Russians from Russia, which Russia's far away. Russia has a lot of little pieces of territory that are not attached to Russia. That, you know what, that reminds me. So we'll just mention those, and then we'll go on to something else. So another piece of territory, this is on the Black Sea, on the Baltic Sea. We'll call this the Baltic Sea, you know, or Baltic Sea. So the Baltic Sea is here, and you have Poland. And right next to Poland is a little piece of Russia over here. And then on the top of that is Lithuania over here. And then Russia is far away on the other side of Lithuania, far away this way. And this was this little enclave is called Kaliningrad, named after, well, the first president of the Soviet Union, Kaliningrad. And this is the capital city over here. So in order to get from Russia to here, you have to pass through Lithuania. But this territory is 100% Russian right over there, and it was taken by Russia at the end of the Second World War as a reward. And who knows, does anybody know this big capital city, what it used to be called? It used to be called Königsberg. So, and you know, there's a lot of Königsberg, and this was the capital. It was a huge city. It was the capital of the province of East Prussia. So between the First World War and the Second World War, Germany ended here. This was Germany here. And then you had Poland, and then you had East Prussia over here. So this was also separated from Germany after the First World War. But before the First World War, this was all part of Germany all the way along there. So that's another little section there. And then there's other places that the Soviets run. This is again on the Black Sea. Black Sea, the same Black Sea that we had on the other map. On the Black Sea, they took over two provinces from Georgia. So this is the Black Sea. This is Georgia over here, country called Georgia. And then there were one little piece of Georgia they took over here called Ossetia, South Ossetia. And this is the capital of Georgia here, Tbilisi. And then they took over another whole little section over here called Abkhazia. So these provinces here, these places used to be Georgia, but the Russia took them over, and they're now run by Russia itself. So Russia has little squares of this on top of South Ossetia is Russia itself. So Russia is on the top here, Russia is on the top here. So they just took this, they took these places from Georgia. But this here is nowhere near Russia, and Transnistria is also nowhere near Russia. So Russia owns or rules these 4 places that are not attached to Russia by any kind of historical thing. They just took them because they took them. And of course they have 20% of Ukraine that they took over, which the war is still continuing over there. So I know that with all the stuff that's going on, with the US elections, all the stuff that's going on in the Middle East with Lebanon and Gaza, a lot of people have forgotten about the Ukrainian war, which started this coming February is going to be 3 years. 3 whole years. And you might remember that the plan of Russia was to move into the Ukraine, take over Kiev, the capital, install one of their stooges as a president, and then let that guy run the country, and it would all be under the Russian influence and Russian rule. But miracle of miracles, of course, the Ukrainians didn't fold. They didn't surrender. They kicked the Russian troops approaching Kiev, the capital, out. And the war has been going on now for two and a half years. Russia did succeed in taking over the Crimean Peninsula back in 2014. Then they took over pieces of eastern Ukraine in the same year. And then they made some extra advances 2 years ago when they invaded, and then everything stopped. The Ukraine did a counteroffensive, which liberated some pieces of territory. And the Ukraine just this year invaded part of Russia itself to take over a small piece. And the war has just been a stalemate. Lots of destruction in the Ukraine from Russian drones and missiles. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been killed, much more on the Russian side. And you might have read, I don't know if you heard, but that North Korea was sending 1,500 soldiers to fight for Russia in that war. 1,500 North Koreans, imagine, all the way from the other side of the world to fight in the war. Each side has foreigners working and fighting for them. There are some Africans fighting for Russia. There's Westerners fighting for the Ukraine. And it's a bloody war where Russia seems to be willing just to sacrifice more and more soldiers, more and more money to fight. And of course, there's no Western countries that want to send their soldiers to Ukraine to help the Ukraine, but they're sending lots of money and they're sending lots of weapons. You might have seen President Biden just this last week. He made another pledge to give more money to the Ukraine. The United States is producing lots and lots of weapons and missiles to be sending to the Ukraine. West Germany, I should say Germany itself, is the second biggest donor to the Ukraine. So the whole Western world is involved in this war in a sort of passive way. The idea being that if Russia takes over the Ukraine, who's next? Who's next? And I'll tell you who's next. It's Moldova, that country that I just pointed out. That would be the next one on the list. After that, who knows? Could be Latvia, could be Lithuania, could be Estonia, those Baltic states which became independent when the Soviet Union collapsed. Could be those places. Who knows? You know, who knows where Putin's appetite could lead him. It also possibly could be some of the Soviet former Soviet Asian republics that have Russian minorities living in them. So if you have a Russian minority living there, it's an excuse for Putin to invade. And in Transnistria, like I just pointed out, they have Russians living there. And there were Russian-speaking people in the eastern Ukraine that, Putin went to sort of save their lives. So, this is it's a crisis that the world has forgotten about. The world has put it aside. When the war in the Middle East broke out, the elections in the United States that everybody's looking at, this ongoing war is the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War. And, we've all more or less put it in our back pockets. So let's leave that for now. Talk about some other things. Let me just see what I got here. See if I've... Oh, yes, that's right. We're talking about paying to vote. Right? I mentioned that this guy, Elon Shore. So you heard another Elon Musk. You heard that he's having a $1 million a day giveaway to anybody who registers to vote and votes Republican. It's going to be like a kind of a draw. And, if you say to yourself, is this legal to buy votes? Because that's what he's doing. He's really buying votes, paying people to vote. It's probably illegal. But just as his sponsor, Mr. Trump, gets away with anything, Elon Musk, such a hero in America for doing so many things, including building Tesla cars from scratch, including the SpaceX project of sending up privately owned rockets to take tourists up into outer space, coming up with all kinds of brilliant ideas of how to reuse a rocket once you sent it up into outer space to get it back and then use it again. The guy definitely has his brilliant moments. Some of them less brilliant. Taking over Twitter is also his thing, but turning it into a kind of a political network. So he's done amazing things and very different things. Usually these sort of genius multi-billionaires, they're experts in one field, and Elon Musk is an expert in thinking up new ideas. That's his expertise. And to have built this electric car from scratch and made it into the model of all electric cars in North America, I mean, that was a super achievement that no one has ever done, to mass produce a car outside of the big three. It seems to be a success. People are buying Teslas. You see them all over the place. Electric cars in general, he set the tone for electric cars. They say, I'm going to build a car that runs on electricity and not on gasoline. And he did it. So his dream came true in that way. It's just that he sees himself to be aligned with Trump. And he appears with Trump. And normally businessmen, business people, I shouldn't say businessmen, but business people don't want to take an open political stand. Because if you do, you're going to lose customers. I mean, imagine if, customers who say, I wouldn't mind buying an electric car and a Tesla, but because Elon Musk is so pro-Trump, I'm not going to buy that car. It turns me off. So normally, people in business don't want to annoy or to alienate their customers. They want customers to buy them. And they don't want to give reasons for a customer not to buy something. But Elon Musk has so thrown his lot in with Trump that anybody who is seriously anti-Trump will think twice before buying any of his products, which includes Teslas, but also includes lots of other things. Subscribing to Twitter, or X as it's now called, social media, and many other ventures that he's put himself into. But this idea of paying people, or giving them a reward of $1 million to register to vote, I don't know. To my thinking, it might be illegal, but certainly people do get away with these things. I'm not going to speak a lot about the American election because you could read all about it and you hear all about it, but this has been a kind of a, we'll say, maybe a turning point in that this past week the polls have shown more support for Trump than he had before. And it's also so puzzling to me how somebody who has gotten more radical, who insults people like with bad words, who breaks every rule in the book, that everybody looks at him and say, oh, well, he's just Trump, he can get away with it because he has a free pass. And it's remarkable that the American public doesn't call him out on it, especially because the opponent, Ms. Harris, is not like especially bad at anything. Once America had a really bad candidate for president. His name was Barry Goldwater. And his idea was, I'm going to take nuclear bombs and drop it on all of America's enemies. And people said, that's not a good idea. And they massively voted against him in the 1960s. There was another terrible candidate, George McGovern, who ran for the Democrats. Not a charismatic leader, associated with the far left wing of the Democratic Party. Didn't present anything as a kind of didn't present anything at all in, in terms of giving people something to vote for. He was a compromise candidate after a very long, bitter convention, and he lost massively to Nixon in the 1972 election. So there have been bad candidates. Those are two examples. But Kamala Harris is not one of them. She doesn't give out any of the bad vibes that these other two candidates gave out. And yet here we are, 2 weeks away from the election, and it's too close to call. I have to say, as somebody who reads a lot, and as somebody who doesn't really, I would say I approach things starting with a neutral outlook. I figured that after January 6th, that riot, that people would blame Trump and say, well, I'll never vote for him again, and look at where we are. So anyway, that's just the state of that election. It does have an effect on us. Some of you might say, so who cares? Like, as Canadians, do we care who wins an American election? It's going to make any difference? It's going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference in a few different ways. Well, here are the ways it'll make a difference. If it's Trump who wins the election, he's very skeptical about NATO and very skeptical about world alliances altogether. He has said in the past that he doesn't see why the United States should be part of NATO, why the United States should be there to protect its allies. Everybody should look after their own business. The United States is not interested in spending money abroad. And that the United States doesn't need allies because the United States is the strongest and the best country in the world. So that's kind of his, and any allies that we have are just there to take advantage of the US. So that's his outlook, that's his attitude in general. He also, of course, is buddy with Putin and says he doesn't think Putin did anything wrong in the invading Ukraine, and had he been president at the time, he would have solved this issue in a day. And the world leaders are so afraid of him because he's so tough that nobody would dare start a war because they know America would jump on them right away. That's his explanation of why, if he were president, there would not have been a war in the Middle East. There would not have been a Gaza, massacre. the Israelis would never be bombing Lebanon because everyone would be so afraid of Trump and his threats that they would just not take part in any military action. Of course, needless to say, this is Trump in his own head, but that's what some people believe in the US because they don't know anything about world events, and they'll believe Trump whatever he says. So the relationship with his allies from a military point of view is going to be strained. He wants the members of NATO and the members of the European alliance to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. And he says the US has been spending to defend everybody, and other countries are getting away with not spending any money so they could give the money in services to their people, while the United States is supporting the defense of the whole free world. So there is an argument there that is made. There is a kind of a logic in that argument. Canada is one of the worst offenders in this process. We spend far less than 2% of our economy on defense because we've always had the Americans to defend us. You know, from the Russians coming over the Arctic, spy satellites, all kinds of stuff like that. When the war in the Ukraine broke out, the European countries were quick to boost up their spending. And most of them are now over 2%, but Canada is not. So you could be sure that we will be urged to spend 2% on our defense. And of course, the way Canada spends money, or the way US would want us to spend money, is to buy American jets, American material, American weapons, American ships, stuff like that. Things that will benefit America, because we don't have an industry here to make warplanes. We just don't have enough need for them. So, you know, this would end up benefiting the US. Now, he also said that he wants to put a tariff on all imports to the United States. Now, this would affect us a lot more because the US is our biggest trading partner. And if he succeeds against the rules of the NAFTA agreement, the new North American Free Trade Association agreement, says that by and large, goods should travel duty-free from the US, Canada, and Mexico. That there should not be duties on goods that are primarily produced in those countries if they're shipped to another country. But, you know, Trump can just break the rules and say, I don't care what the rules say, and I'm going to put tariffs on Canadian exports for security reasons. So you're allowed under the North American Free Trade Agreement to add tariffs if it's for security reasons. And Trump will just say, sure, it's a security reason. You know, we can't, we have to charge tariffs on Canadian tomatoes coming into the US because it's a security issue. So, you know, he can use that excuse for anything, and he did already. When he was in power before, he put a 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum and on Canadian steel because he just said, look, American producers are complaining and I'm going to do it, even though he wasn't allowed to do it. So that's a big danger for Canada because we are much more dependent on the US than the US is dependent on Canada. I mean, what does the US need from Canada that it can't get elsewhere? On the other hand, Canada is not a neighbor to any other country. So we have to trade with the US. There's such a huge market. Without them, our exports would be severely harmed, especially things like, for example, oil. Canada produces lots and lots of oil in the Alberta, you know, the Alberta tar sands, we'll call them, and all that oil gets shipped to the U.S. because it's a kind of a quality of oil that's not. They don't have enough refineries in Canada to refine it, so it just gets shipped in pipelines to the U.S. Imagine if the U.S. said, "No, we're not taking it." Then what do? You have, it's like, you know, Alberta would go broke in not very long because they wouldn't be able to sell their most precious resource. The same thing, I mean, even for Quebec and our lumber industry and newsprint industry, I mean, all that stuff goes to the US because that's where the demand is. We were even shipping hydroelectricity through our wires to the US. So if he puts a tariff on all these imports from Canada, we have nobody else to sell it to. That's what my point is. Nobody else. There's no we have nobody else as a neighbor, except St. Pierre and Miquelon, Greenland. But so those are just a couple of the dangers. Now, of course, there's another aspect that if Trump does win the election, there will be some thousands of Americans who will want to move here. If that indeed, there's a big difference between wanting to do something and doing it. And a small percentage of people who say they want to do it actually end up doing it. But those people who would come would be a great addition to the country, because these people come with skills, with money, with savings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are just a couple of the ramifications of what would happen if Trump were elected. Now, one could say that we have an election coming up next year in Canada, and the way it looks now, the Conservatives are going to win the election. And it's quite possible then that if Trump is elected in the US and Poilievre is elected here, that they could be sort of buddies. So you don't know. That's another thing to speculate about. Let me just change to, well, first of all, let me see if you've got any comments or questions, and then we'll change to something different. So today is October 22nd. You could see how I came dressed, shorts, short sleeves. I was out walking up mountain this morning. I mean, the amount, or let me put it in a different way. All of us sitting in this room are somewhat seniors, right? We're all 50 plus. I would even say we're probably 60 plus. I would say, if you're looking at me, it's 70 plus. And there's probably 80 plus. Think of the changes that we lived through and what we saw with our own eyes. For example, this, I'm getting to the point, but we'll get to it in a roundabout way. I mean, I remember when we didn't have television. Television was brand new. We certainly didn't have computers, which changed the world in so many ways. We certainly didn't have cell phones, although a cell phone is just an extension of a telephone added to a computer together. But we didn't have those things. How much of these things changed our lives within our own lifetimes? I mean, it really is amazing. We had electricity, we did. So that was an enormous change in people's lives when that was introduced. But the things that I mentioned, and especially computers and all that the computers are able to do, is really a change. And now this artificial intelligence, which allows masses of data to be analyzed and quickly to pick out what you're looking for, is another sort of what they call a game changer. But we haven't seen the practical effects of that yet, but that will come. But one of the things that we also saw is climate change, because it's October 22nd. I'm walking around like this. I mean, all of us who lived here all our lives, and even if you didn't live here all your lives, but if you know about it, I mean, sort of, let's say, Labor Day weekend was the end. After that, you got your jackets on and you started to get your snow shovel ready. And this fact of climate change has had enormous amounts of ramifications. So let's just mention a few of the things that just happened recently. Let's talk about 2 days ago. In Vancouver, they had 10 inches of rain in one day, 24 hours, 10 inches of rain. That's, almost a foot of rain. And yes, it rains in Vancouver. We all know that, especially in the wintertime. But it doesn't rain 10 inches in one time, especially not in October. Our Dakari Expressway flooded twice this summer, 2 times. We had enough downpours to flood, and close off the Dakari Expressway with cars floating in it. In Europe, they just this past month in Europe, they've had huge amount of floods in Central and Eastern Europe. And then if we go just a little bit further past, there were enormous amount of rains in China, the hurricanes that we just saw in Milton and Helene going into Florida. St. Petersburg had 18 inches of rain in one shot. And I mean, think of it, Florida's pretty flat. So if you have 18 inches of rain, it's not going anywhere soon. So huge amounts of flooding, unprecedented record amount of rain. The 10 most damaging hurricanes in the United States, 9 out of 10 happened since the year 2000. So think of it, they've been keeping records, good records, since at least the 1850s. And 9 out of the 10 most damaging hurricanes happened just, not even within our lifetimes, but just since 2000. So it tells you definitely that climate change is on the run. I was reading an article that's saying that satellites are looking at Antarctica and they're seeing stuff is growing there. Antarctica used to be completely ice covered and rocks, bare rocks, and too cold for anything to grow. And now they're looking down, they're seeing green color on the surface of Antarctica, of course, naturally not in the middle of the continent, but on the edges. And that's a sign that ice is melting, as it is in Greenland, the biggest 2 ice sheets in the world. And the results of this are many. The heating up of the atmosphere means that the oceans are getting warmer. If the oceans are getting warmer, it means that the volume of water in the ocean grows, because warm water takes up more space than cold water. So without adding any extra water from extra rainfall, without adding any extra water from melting of ice sheets, the oceans are going to expand anyway because the average temperature is so high. And of course, it's the hot temperatures of the ocean that cause these severe hurricanes to take place in the first place. We all know that the warm water in the ocean is the fuel for the hurricanes. And the water in the Gulf of Mexico in late September, early October, the water temperature was 85 and 86 degrees. That's hot for that time of year. And that's the reason why you had a Category 5 hurricane, which developed, of course, when it hits land, it goes down. But a Category 5 is the highest category they have. They don't have any numbers higher than 5. And they're so rare, and yet we just had one. So when you add to the volume of the water going up, the amount of melting of glaciers from Greenland and Antarctica and Europe and everywhere else, that all that water ends up only in the ocean. Everything goes downhill, and you can't get more downhill than the ocean. So when you do have a storm, that means the storm surge, the damage caused by high water rushing onto the land is much higher, because the amount of ocean water is much higher, and the winds are much higher. So you get enormous amount of losses of property. So I was reading an article this week about insurance losses as a result of the Florida hurricanes, and they're over $100 billion. Now, the state of Florida is the hardest state to get insurance from because obviously, things happen there. So they set up this company called, not Citizens Union, it's called it's in my notes somewhere, Citizens Insurance Company. And what it is if you can't get insurance anywhere else in Florida, they will give you insurance. But the but is that if the company loses money, they have to make up the loss. So either the state has to give more money into the fund, or all the insurance policy holders have to pay more in order to have the company break even. And the company just announced, we don't have the money. So somebody's going to have to pay in Florida for all those losses. And it's going to be the people who live there through their taxes or through, people who have their policies. And people are going without insurance because they can't afford it. A big percentage of people in Florida don't have insurance because they can't afford it. Now, that's fine if you own your house without a mortgage. But if you have a mortgage on your house, obviously the bank wants you to be insured because in case something happens, the bank wants their money back. So, homeowners are stuck between a rock and a hard place. If they, they can't afford insurance, but they have to get it, then, they have to cut their spending on other things to just be able to afford their insurance. Let me see. The other factor about the increased damages is not just because of the intensity of the storms, but there's just more people living in the world. And the people want to live in nice places. And nice places are along oceans and along rivers. And so there's more people living in places that are vulnerable. And so when a storm comes, the damage is all the more because there's just more to damage. And no country and no state is willing to say, oh, I know there's a beautiful stretch of ocean here, but we don't want you to build here because there could be a storm. Versus if you build here, we get huge amount of taxes because your property is so valuable. So it's very hard for a municipality or county to say, no, we just don't want any building to go on in the nicest parts of the place because we want to limit our losses. So therefore, populations increase, people increase, they go live in nice places, and then these places get damaged. So that's another reason why the amount of damage is just so high. Let me just see here. Yeah. Second here. So another thing, we're talking about what we have lived through, what great changes we're living through. Another of the great changes we're living through on this very subject is that we're looking at alternative sources of energy. And we never had electric cars before, 20 years ago or even 15 years ago. Electricity was always generated either from burning coal or oil or gas, or from hydropower or from nuclear power. That was it. There was no other sources of electricity. And now we are looking at solar power and wind power to replace the carbon-emitting fuel sources. And at first, it was just a kind of an idea that people said were thought up in a lab. That some professor in some university said, you know what? If we put up some solar panels and we join them together and we run a wire from the solar panels to a electricity pole, we can get electricity. And people said, yeah, that in theory it sounds good, but it'll never work out in practice. And now before our very eyes, we're at a situation now where worldwide, 20% of all the electricity generated worldwide now comes from solar and wind powered systems. And if you add in hydroelectric power, it comes to 30% of all the world's electricity is now generated from renewable resources, renewable sources. And that is an enormous change from what used to be. And all of this, of course, is being done to try to limit the increase in temperatures around the world. But fighting against that trend is the trend of having people, more of us in the world, and richer people. So that's the other point. Now this is something we're living through that we don't see. But what we don't see is that pretty well all around the world, except for a few small places, people's standard of living have gotten better. I mean, just again in our lifetimes, China in 1978, their income per person was $250 a year. $250 a year. So today in our money, let's call it $750 a year. What's $750 a year? It's nothing. And to China today, they have hundreds of millions of people who live middle-class lives, own their own apartments, have a car or have a motorcycle, have a job, have an income, can afford to travel abroad. It's a wholesale change there. And then when you add the world's biggest country, which still has, is one generation behind China, we'll say, but India, they've also had a massive increase in their standards of living. So what does that mean to us? And what does that mean to the issue that we're talking about? It means an awful lot, because I visited China in 2000. That's sort of, did I say 78? I meant 1998. It was just 2 years after they had sort of gotten going, or maybe 10 years after they got going. There were still tons of bicycles, tons of bicycles. The streets were just full of bicycles. You go to China today, you know, you could barely find a bicycle. And certainly not one used like for transportation and carrying goods and packages and all kinds of stuff like that. Nobody has a bicycle. If you have it, it's to do, you know, cycling like we do it here. So, I mean, this is within our own lifetime, we've seen that. So if people are not on bicycles, so what are they doing? They're on motorcycles, on cars. People need and want air conditioning. Think, you know, India, the world's largest country, is by and large hot. China, we'll call 2/3 of it is very hot. Other countries in Southeast Asia, Korea, also. So all this extra temperature means people need air conditioning. But how are you going to get the electricity for air conditioning? Well, then you have to burn fuel to generate that electricity. So even though we're using sustainable electricity generation systems, the total amount of electricity being produced is higher than ever before. And therefore, the total amount of carbon fossil fuels like coal is still higher than ever before. So coal in the world is the biggest source of electricity generation even today. And it's growing. The amount of coal being used is not going down. It's going down in Europe and North America, but elsewhere in the world it's still going up, because there's so many more customers for that coal, because they need electricity that their grandparents never needed. They lived in houses without electricity. Today everybody, you know, they have a TV, they have a smartphone, they have a car, they have you know, air conditioning. You know, you need, in the modern world, to run a computer, you need a lot of power. Multiply that out over all the computers around, and you can see how much more electricity is needed. Now, here's a question. Per capita, meaning per person, which country in the world produces the most electricity? Country. Canada is correct. We are number one in the world in amount of electricity produced per person. Number one. It's because, well, we're lucky in that most of our electricity in Canada is produced by hydropower. So therefore, once you produce it, you know, then we could sell it. We could sell it to the States. We're not selling as much as we used to because they, in their own way, have got their own sources of natural gas to produce their own electricity. But still, we were sending electricity down to New England from Quebec for generations already, and we're still doing it. So, you know, we know we're living through a time when at least we understand that we have problems. We understand what causes those problems, but we are not able to fix those problems. And that's something, like I said, that we are all in our generation, and maybe only our generation, is living through this particular transition where you could walk out on October 22nd and say, hey, you know, I cycled by the beach. You know, there's a beach in Verdun, a public beach. You know, people were sitting on the beach in their bathing suits yesterday. Sitting on the beach in their bathing suits on October 21st. I mean, I say, hey, what's this, you know? It really is something, it's something that we live with every single day, but unless you stop to think about it and remember what things used to be like, and I remember, you know, and I'm sure you all must remember, minus 25, minus 30. One day I took my wife, she had an exam downtown, and she said, oh, I'll take the bus. I said, it's minus 34. I said, you know, I'm just gonna drive down there and wait for you because who knows? At minus 34, like what could be, you know? We haven't had anything like that in a long time, but we could. I was just reading again this week that, well, let's talk about agriculture and food production. We'll talk about how does climate change affect that, because it has to. If things are getting warmer or hotter or drier or wetter, it's going to have to affect that. So today there was an article about cocoa prices being very high and Halloween candies, you know, going to be expensive because the price of chocolate is so high. Because cocoa is a very fussy product. It wants only to live in certain places. It doesn't want too hot. It doesn't want too dry. It doesn't want too wet. It has to have like the Goldilocks climate to grow it. And because of climate change, sometimes it's too hot, sometimes it's too wet. If it's too wet, then they get mildew. The plants get mildew and rot. If it's too dry, of course, they don't have enough water. So, and there's only 2 countries in the world that produce 70% of all the cocoa in the world. That's Ivory Coast and Ghana. So if things go wrong there, you know, the whole chocolate world is all turned upside down. But the article I was reading was about champagne production in Great Britain. Now, would you ever think that Great Britain would be this great champagne producer? And yet, because of climate change, the same grapes that are used to produce champagne in France are being planted in Great Britain, and they're getting fantastic champagnes that have won all kinds of rewards. Now, you know you can't call champagne champagne unless it comes from Champagne, but let's call it substitute champagne. Their substitute champagne is so good that the great champagne houses of France are buying land in Great Britain to ensure themselves that they will be able to grow, you know, champagne if things don't go well in France. And growers of grapes in France, in southern France, are finding it so hot that they're starting to move their production further north. I was reading that the fruit producers in Chile, you know, which is such a huge producer of fruit, it's getting to be so hot and so dry that they're moving their production south in Chile. In other words, south meaning where it's colder because of climate change. We here in Quebec, I cycle all over the countryside of Quebec, and there's soybeans growing everywhere. When I was a kid, I never saw a soybean growing in a field in Quebec. So we do have, and not to mention all the vineyards that have opened up here all over the place, you know, which is something else. So climate change is definitely something which affects food production, and you know, in some cases it could be beneficial, in other cases it's a disaster. And that same issue also goes to fish and where the fish live. I was reading an article about Newfoundland lobster fishermen. Like, did you see that? Like, where did lobsters ever come to Newfoundland? They're down in, you know, Nova Scotia and in Maine. But because the water is getting warmer and warmer, the lobsters are moving further north. And so they've arrived in Newfoundland, and now the Newfoundland fishermen want licenses to fish lobsters. So, you know, nothing stays the same. In nature, nothing stays the same. And human beings are our most important quality that we have, besides being able to work together, is our adaptability. And this slow-moving change that we see in the world is something that humans will be adapting to now for generations. Let me just mention that the Northwest Passage in Canada, which was always icebound, if it's now gonna melt away and become a free passage, then we already had one cruise ship, a cruise line, actually went through the Bering Strait in the west and passed along the Northwest Territories and Iqaluit and came out the Labrador Straits and went back down to the east coast of the US. That means that you could not have to go through the Panama Canal. In Russia, it's even easier to pass along the whole top of Russia if you start off in Norway or in London, and you just send a ship along the top of Russia, you end up coming through the same Bering Straits, and you end up in Japan or in Korea or China, and you don't have to go through the Suez Canal for that. So imagine what a revolution in shipping that would be if the world warms up and you know, these passages become commercially available. So just to think about how these things have changed in our own lifetimes. The huge changes that we've seen are just amazing, and you know, there's more to come, because even if we try our best to limit the growth of warmth in the world and to keep the average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius above historical means, because that's what they're saying. But, you know, when I first started reading about this, they said if the temperature goes up by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above the historical mean, meaning like in the 1850s, before industrial revolution got going, then the world will collapse. And we've already passed the 1.5 degrees. We've just passed it. So now they're saying, okay, well, now it's 2 degrees. If things go over 2 degrees, then the world will collapse. But we're getting there, you know, slowly but surely. I'm sure in, you know, the next 50 odd years, we will get to that 2%, even though we're trying so hard not to. But just the fact that all the things that I mentioned before, the growing population, greater need for electricity, more transportation, more airplanes flying, just means that the world is getting warmer. So, and you know, as I think I once mentioned here, I read somewhere only 3 countries in the world have a net benefit from global warming: Russia, Canada, and Iceland. Those 3 places. So we're in the goods. But there's 197 countries in the world. That means 194 of them are not going to be in the goods. And, you know, this could lead to all kinds of things. Maybe let me just check my watch. I'll finish off by saying that one of the things it leads to is economic migration. And I spoke last time about migration and how, you know, migration is such a big issue in the US elections. Migration is forced on people who cannot make a living doing the things that their grandparents did in their own countries. They can't grow the same amount of food on the same amount of land with the same amount of water because the water is not there, because the temperature is too high, because the land has become degraded and polluted. And so these people have no choice but to move. And they're going to move to where they think they can have a better life. And that includes places like, you know, Western Europe and Canada and the US. So things are all tied together. One of the messages I want to say is that you might think of things separately. You know, climate change, well, okay, so I don't have to wear such a heavy jacket. But it all ties together to everything else. And, you know, that's the world that we're living in. Yeah, any comments, questions about this? Let me just take a quick peek at my notes and see if I've forgotten anything here. It's always something. Yeah, the Amazon River, you know, the Amazon River, the river with the largest volume of water in the world, like parts of it are dried up. I saw pictures of, they're stranded in villages, they have no roads. Their only means of transportation is by boat. And if the river dries up, the tributaries of the river dries up, these people are left high and dry. So you know, Brazil and the Amazon is the biggest sort of single carbon sink on the planet. And if the trees start dying because it's getting so dry, well, you know, that is a crisis not just for them, but for everybody else. And, you know, also the drying out of the lower Sahara means that all the herdsmen who live along there, they all have herds of sheep and goats. They have to move further south to get grass for their animals. The moment they go further south, they meet up with farmers. And the farmers and the herdsmen have been fighting wars in Nigeria and in Mali and in all the countries of Africa, where the south of the Sahara and north of the jungle forests, in that area there, they've been fighting now for a long, long time over water resources. And so, again, climate change causes these civil wars to go on in these countries, and the civil war will often break into a war between countries. So that's how the circle comes around. Let's see here. Let's see what else we got. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Any of you follow the program called The Deadliest Catch? Do you ever read this? You know that program? No, TV show. It's about crab fishermen in Alaska, fishing for king crab. These king crab, you know, are extremely expensive, monster-sized crabs with these big legs. They've had no season for 2 years. They were canceled. The season was canceled because the crabs left where they're fishing. They're not sure. But, you know, again, if the water's getting too warm, some animals are really adaptable, like sharks. They could live in hot water, they could live in cold water, they can live pretty well everywhere around the whole world. Some animals are very, very specifically adapted only to a specific kind of water, a specific temperature, and if it's any out of that, they can't survive. like salmon, for example, not adaptable at all. And, that's why salmon, along the BC coast, they're just not there in the numbers they used to be. So this does have implications in so many different ways, and so many different parts of our lives are affected by this. And because change happens a day at a time, we just don't notice it. We just don't notice it. But when you sum it all up and you say, how do you like that? I once remember having a television set and there were like 3 channels on it, and I had this box and I had to press a button and all this kind of thing. Say, hey, that's not our lives anymore. So anyway, just a few thoughts. So tell me if you've got comments, questions. I'm here for that. Same thing for people who are listening on Zoom, which I understand there's quite a few people out there. I met somebody who said, I saw you on Zoom. You gave a great lecture. I said, wow, next time show up over here. Yeah, I think he was listening in Toronto, actually. So, oops. Yeah, so comments, questions about anything you like. Doesn't have to be about this, could be about something. You might have heard this gentleman passed away in the United States whose name was Gulen, Fethullah Gulen. He led he was a very long time Islamic leader in Turkey. At the time when Turkey was a secular republic with secular leaders, he was the one who led the kind of Islamic revival of Turkey. And he was really prosecuted for doing that. But when Erdogan took over, him and Erdogan had a great fight over kind of who should be the boss of Islam in Turkey. And Gulen lost. And it's because Gulen had not just a kind of a religious school and religious school system, but he also was spilling over into politics. That really got Erdogan's goat, and he was considered persona non grata, and he escaped from Turkey before he could get arrested. And from the exile, he led a consistent anti-Erdogan movement in Turkey. And if you might recall, there was a coup attempted in Turkey a few years ago by the military using airplanes to try to kick Erdogan out of power. And they wanted to assassinate him in his hotel. He was on holiday, and they just missed. And Erdogan blamed this coup on the followers of Gulen, and arrested and purged teachers, purged the army, purged everybody who said, you're all Gulenists. And so Mr. Gulen himself just died yesterday in where he was living in, I think, Pennsylvania. But it's for Erdogan, I'm sure he had a cake baked for the occasion. Anybody with any other comments or questions? Take your time. Yes, over there, yeah. So the question was, is it going to make a difference that Israel took Sinwar's body to negotiate with Hamas? And unfortunately, there's been this kind of, we'll call it a trade in bodies, or a kind of using a body of a dead person as a means of leverage and bargaining. And Hamas has been holding bodies of Israeli soldiers now for 20 odd years. I don't know where they keep these bodies. That's the question I'd like to know. But Israel proved a few different times that it's willing to trade valuable things in order to get back the bodies of its citizens. And Israel is thinking, well, maybe Hamas is the same thing, but I doubt it very much. I think that their idea is that Sinwar was a martyr, and that whatever happens to his physical remains are not as important as the rewards he's going to get in heaven for all of his good work. And I doubt if it's going to count for much. That would be my. And besides, I mean, Hamas is so disorganized now that they don't have any real strong, unified leadership to even make a deal or even to bargain, if you know what I mean. But it was very sad to read about the 6 hostages who were murdered. And these hostages were very likely Sinwar's life insurance policy, that he kept these hostages near him for so long. And then apparently they were so starved to death that when he had to evacuate the tunnels, he couldn't take the hostages with him. And then they were just murdered just because they didn't want the Israelis to find them. It's a super sad, very sad story. And of course, you all heard about this woman who committed suicide this week because she was a survivor from the music festival. And, you know, listen, when people see trauma, when people see tragedy, whether you're a soldier or a civilian, I mean, the effect that it can have on you is just so severe that, you know, you feel so guilty for surviving, and some of your friends didn't, that some people choose to commit suicide. And it's just so sad. The whole thing is just so sad. You know, whether this is leading anywhere, it just remains to be seen. The fact is that Hamas is getting weaker and weaker, but is there a point where they would ever surrender? I somehow doubt it. So, you know, so long as they're a threat, you know, Israel is still sacrificing soldiers every day. And of course, needless to say, there are innocent civilians who are being killed as a result. It's innocent civilians in Gaza who are being killed as a result of the, you know, this ongoing war. And it's a terrible tragedy. The whole thing is really, and it's set Israel back so far that it will take a long time to recover from this, this disaster. Anybody else?
There's a question from Zoom. How will the Lebanon and Gaza situations end, in your opinion?
How will they end, in my opinion? Okay, I think that the Lebanon situation is easier to resolve than the Gaza situation. We'll start with that. And the reason for that is because Lebanon is a separate country from Israel. Israel has settled with Lebanon on 3 different times since 2000. Israel has invaded Lebanon and has left. What Israel wants from Lebanon is a guarantee that the Hezbollah won't attack Israel from Lebanon. And they had an agreement that was made with the Lebanese government and the United Nations that Hezbollah would move all of its weapons north of the Litani River, that the Lebanese armed forces and the United Nations would move into that border area to make sure that the Hezbollah doesn't come back, and it failed. It failed. Hezbollah came back. But the recipe is still good. In other words, Israel doesn't want to take over Lebanon, and Israel has no interest to destroy Hezbollah if Hezbollah has no interest in attacking Israel. Hezbollah is, among other things, is a political party in Lebanon, and Israel really, at this point, didn't want to get involved in Lebanese politics, which is a whole other subject in and of itself. So if Hezbollah can be disarmed, or if not disarmed, stop using its weapons against Israel, and if Israel has a guarantee, and if Israel has a means of saying, well, if this doesn't work, then we're coming back, then that problem could be resolved. Of course, Israel wants to weaken Hezbollah as much as possible so that Hezbollah on its own won't be able to attack Israel. And that's why they're hitting all their targets. And that's why apparently They claim that there's a building in Beirut that has $500 million in cash that Hezbollah owns, and so they're trying to bomb the building. You know, you can just look around and pick up the money after the bomb is finished. So maybe, you know, but that problem is not the most difficult one. In other words, it's a question of security and territory. But the Gaza situation is part of the ongoing Palestinian issue between Israel and the Palestinians, and that won't be resolved for good until somehow or other the Palestinians can get a state of their own in their mind. And if they don't get a state of their own, then there will be a continuous opposition to Israel and Israel's rule, you know, in the West Bank or in Gaza. And so in other words, the recipe for fighting is always going to be there, and whether fighting breaks out or not is just a question of circumstances. So unless Israel comes to a final solution over this whole issue, and it's been going on since Israel was born 76 years ago, this will continue. So that's why I'm saying that you know, if Hamas is pacified, and if Israel either takes over the Gaza Strip and runs it itself, which it did from 1967 to 2005, and it left the Gaza Strip because it just found that it was just too tough to be there. So, I mean, if Israel takes over the Gaza Strip again, the same 2 million people are living there, and the same 2 million people are going to be against Israeli rule, and another version of Hamas will be born to fight against Israel. So that's why it's a much tougher solution than the Lebanese one. Right now, the controversy is, you know, once Israel pacifies Gaza, should they allow Israeli settlers to come back in? And Netanyahu says, I'm not doing it, but his government would love to do it, to punish the Gazans for doing what they did. And say, look, you see, now we're back here again. But that's not the end of the story, because these settlers will have to be protected. These settlers will be attacked whenever possible. And it will just lead to more tension in the Gaza Strip, which is what caused these people to leave in 2005. So, you know, the world is complaining to Mr. Netanyahu that what's the plan? Like, what are you going to do once you win the war? And he hasn't said. He hasn't said how is Gaza going to be rebuilt? Who is going to run Gaza? What will be Israel's role in Gaza? None of these questions, which you think are so important, have been answered. So that's where that lies. Yes, sir, over there. Well, I think nothing can be resolved in my mind, and that is for the reason that to this day, there hasn't been a majority of Palestinians who are willing to accept Israel as a permanent Jewish state. And in their minds, they would like to turn back the clock to 1947 and start all over again to fight for that same territory. So unless there's a majority of Israelis who are willing to accept the legitimacy of a Palestinian state, and a majority of Palestinians who are willing to accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state in Israel, then the long-term solution is not there. And so far, the long-term solution is not there. It's not Israel's fault that the Palestinians have not accepted Israel as a Jewish state. If there was a majority on both sides for peace, then I do believe that they could come to a mutual agreement, just as every other country in the world that once fought each other, from Great Britain and Ireland to Great Britain and France, from France to Germany, from Turkey to Greece. I mean, there have been international conflicts forever and ever and ever, and they did get resolved. So, you know, if the majority on both sides want to resolve it, it's doable. It takes compromise, of course. It takes, you know, a lot of compromise and a lot of trust. And for this generation, this isn't going to happen. The attack in Gaza has been so severe and so psychologically damaging to Israel and its own sense of security that they could never trust the Palestinians to do anything. So we're going to have to wait another generation, I think, for this possibility to happen, that there should be a resolution. It could be that I'm wrong, but anyway, that's kind of the way I look at it. Okay, so listen, thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure for me to come and to speak to you, and I'll be on Zoom next Tuesday, and then after that I'm going, you know, like I said, traveling around Asia and you know, coming up with new material for maybe for next spring. So we'll see you again. Thanks a lot.